A pit bull, abandoned and chained to the train tracks, waits helplessly as the sound of an approaching train grows louder. With no one in sight, her story seems destined for tragedy. But what happened in that final, heart-pounding moment will leave you speechless. Stay with us to witness a tale of courage, resilience, and hope that will forever change the way you see pit bulls. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more inspiring stories like this to you. The morning was unusually cold, the kind of chill that seeped into bones and stayed there. The outskirts of the small industrial town were as desolate as ever, with rusting metal scraps and wild weeds claiming the abandoned spaces. The railroad tracks that cut through the area seemed forgotten, serving as a pathway only for freight trains and the occasional trespasser. For Daisy, a pit bull with soft brown eyes and a body battered by neglect, it was a place of abandonment, a cruel, final destination chosen by someone who had once called her family. Daisy's fur, once a glossy caramel, was now matted with mud and grime. Her body bore the marks of a life lived in hardship. Scars crisscrossed her legs, her ribs jutted out painfully, and her once wagging tail lay limp against the cold ground. She had been tied to the tracks with a short, frayed leash, the nylon digging into her neck whenever she tried to pull free. Her breaths came in shallow pants, and her eyes, which had once radiated life, now held only quiet resignation. The sun was rising slowly, casting long shadows over the tracks. Daisy shivered against the biting wind, her body curling into itself for warmth. She hadn't eaten in days, and her energy was nearly gone. Her ears perked slightly at the distant hum of an approaching train, but she was too weak to react. Instead, she lay her head down on the cold steel rail, bracing for the inevitable. Several miles away, Jake Henderson, a seasoned train conductor in his early 50s, was preparing for his usual morning shift. Jake was a man of routine, someone who thrived on the predictability of his job. He had spent decades guiding trains across the state, watching landscapes blur past and making sure his cargo reached its destination. But that morning, as he adjusted his conductor's cap and sipped his black coffee, something gnawed at him, a vague sense of unease he couldn't quite shake. Jake's wife, Maria, had always teased him about his sixth sense. Over the years, Jake had developed a knack for spotting trouble before it happened. Whether it was a mechanical issue with the train or an unexpected storm brewing on the horizon, Jake always seemed to know when something was off. That morning the feeling was stronger than usual. He shrugged it off as he boarded the train, unaware of the life-or-death situation awaiting him just a few miles down the tracks. The train roared to life, its powerful engine drowning out the quiet of the early morning. As it picked up speed, Jake settled into his seat, his eyes scanning the familiar stretch of tracks ahead. The hum of the rails and the rhythmic clatter of wheels usually brought him a sense of calm, but today it felt different, tense, heavy. Back on the tracks, Daisy stirred slightly at the growing rumble in the distance. Her ears twitched, her instincts warning her of danger, but her body betrayed her. She couldn't muster the strength to stand, let alone pull against the leash that held her captive. The train's horn blared, loud and jarring, and for a brief moment, panic flashed in her eyes. She tried to tug at the leash, her paws scraping against the gravel, but it was no use. Exhausted, she collapsed onto the tracks again, her head resting against the steel rail. Jake's eyes narrowed as he spotted something unusual in the distance. At first it appeared to be a bundle of rags or debris scattered on the tracks. He adjusted the train's speed, his gut telling him to slow down. As the train drew closer, the debris began to take shape. A living creature. Jake's heart skipped a beat when he realized it was a dog, a pit bull no less. She was lying motionless, her body unnaturally still. "Dear God," Jake muttered under his breath, his hands moving instinctively to slow the train. He grabbed the radio and barked a quick command to the engineer. "Emergency stop. There's something on the tracks up ahead." The train's brakes screeched as it began to slow, but Jake knew it wouldn't stop in time. The dog was directly in their path. He leaned out of the window, the wind whipping at his face as he tried to gauge the distance. The dog didn't move. She was either too weak to run or had given up entirely. With the train grinding to a halt, Jake jumped into action. As soon as it stopped, he leaped down from the cabin and sprinted toward the dog. His boots crunched against the gravel, his breath coming in sharp bursts. "Hang on, girl," he whispered as he approached, his heart pounding. Daisy's eyes flickered open briefly, her gaze meeting his for a split second. It was a look of pure surrender, a silent plea for help. Jake felt a lump rise in his throat. He crouched beside her, his hands working quickly to free her from the leash. The nylon was tight, but he managed to unclip it. Lifting her gently, he cradled her in his arms, shocked by how light she felt. "You're safe now," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. The sound of the train's engine faded into the background as Jake carried her away from the tracks, determined to save her. Daisy's body was limp in Jake's arms, her frail frame telling a story of hardship and neglect. She barely moved as he carried her back to the train, her head resting weakly against his chest. Jake's heart ached with every step, each shallow breath she took, reminding him how close she had come to death. He muttered soothing words as he walked, though he wasn't sure if she could even hear him. The train crew, who had gathered near the cabin after the emergency stop, looked on with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "What's going on?" asked Tom, the train engineer, a burly man with a perpetual scowl. When he saw the dog in Jake's arms, his expression softened. "Is she alive?" "Just barely," Jake replied, his voice tight. "She's freezing and starved. I need to get her warm." The crew quickly cleared a space in the cabin, throwing down an old blanket for Jake to lay Daisy on. Her body trembled as he gently placed her down, her eyes fluttering open for a brief moment before closing again. Tom handed Jake his thermos of coffee. "It's not much, but it's warm. Maybe it'll help." Jake poured a small amount into the cap, letting it cool before carefully dripping it onto Daisy's tongue. At first, she didn't respond, but after a moment, her tongue flicked out, tasting the liquid. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give Jake hope. "She's a fighter," Jake murmured, more to himself than anyone else. He wrapped the blanket around her as best he could and sat down beside her, his hand resting on her head. The train cabin was warm, and slowly, Daisy's shivering began to subside. Meanwhile, the rest of the crew debated their next move. "We can't just take her with us," Tom said, crossing his arms. "Company policy doesn't allow animals on board." "To hell with policy," Jake snapped, his usual calm demeanor breaking. "This dog was left to die, tied to the damn tracks. Someone wanted her dead. I'm not leaving her out here to freeze." The crew exchanged uneasy glances, but none of them argued further. Jake's reputation as a fair and level-headed man preceded him, and they knew better than to push him when he was this resolute. As the train resumed its journey, Jake's mind raced. He couldn't stop thinking about the cruelty it must have taken to leave Daisy tied to the tracks. Who would do such a thing? And why? His anger simmered beneath the surface, but he pushed it aside for now. The immediate priority was keeping Daisy alive. Every so often he checked on her, offering small sips of water and bits of a sandwich he had in his bag. To his relief, Daisy began to respond more. She licked his hand weakly, her eyes opening a little wider each time. By the time the train reached its next stop, Daisy had managed to lift her head slightly. It was a small victory, but it filled Jake with determination. He knew he couldn't keep her on the train indefinitely. She needed proper care, and fast. The train pulled into the station of a nearby town, a sleepy place with a few scattered houses and a general store. Jake carried Daisy off the train, her body still wrapped in the blanket. The crew watched as he disappeared down the platform, their silent support following him. Jake's first stop was the local vet clinic, a modest building with a hand-painted sign that read, "Dr. Harris Veterinary Services." The clinic wasn't open yet, but Jake pounded on the door until a light flickered on inside. An older woman with graying hair and kind eyes opened the door, her expression shifting to concern when she saw Daisy. "Bring her in," she said without hesitation, stepping aside to let Jake through. Inside the clinic, Dr. Harris worked quickly. She examined Daisy with practiced hands, her brow furrowing as she assessed the extent of her injuries. "She's malnourished, dehydrated, and hypothermic," the vet said, her voice calm but serious. "But she's lucky. No broken bones or internal injuries that I can see." Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Will she make it?" Dr. Harris glanced at him, her eyes softening. "She has a chance, but it's going to take time and care. Whoever did this to her—" She shook her head, unable to finish the thought. "I'll do everything I can." As Daisy was hooked up to an IV and settled into a warm recovery area, Jake finally allowed himself to relax. He sat in the waiting room, his mind replaying the events of the morning. The image of Daisy lying on the tracks was burned into his memory, a haunting reminder of the cruelty some people were capable of. But alongside that image was another, Daisy licking his hand, her eyes filled with a quiet, fragile trust. Jake didn't know what the future held for her, but one thing was certain: he wasn't going to abandon her. The hours at the vet clinic passed slowly. Daisy remained under Dr. Harris's watchful care, her frail body wrapped in blankets as the IV dripped life back into her veins. Jake hadn't left the waiting room, pacing back and forth while stealing glances at the clock. He couldn't shake the thought of her lying helplessly on the tracks, and the quiet trust in her eyes when he'd lifted her into his arms. That look lingered in his mind, pushing him to stay by her side. Dr. Harris finally emerged from the exam room, her face a mix of exhaustion and hope. "She's stable," she said softly, "but it'll be a long road. Malnutrition and exposure have taken a toll on her body, and she's severely anemic. She'll need round-the-clock care for the next few weeks." Jake nodded, his jaw tightening. "I'll do whatever it takes. Just tell me what she needs." The vet studied him for a moment, her kind eyes narrowing slightly. "You care about her," she observed, "more than most people would for a dog they just found." Jake hesitated, searching for the right words. "I've seen a lot of cruelty in my life," he admitted. "But tying a dog to train tracks, that's a different kind of evil. I can't just walk away from her." Dr. Harris nodded, seeming to understand. "Well, she's lucky to have found you, but this isn't just about medical care. She's going to need patience and love to recover from whatever she's been through." Jake left the clinic that evening with Daisy resting in the back seat of his truck. Dr. Harris had provided him with medication, special food, and strict instructions for her care. As he drove home, the quiet hum of the engine filled the air, occasionally broken by Daisy's soft breaths. She still hadn't moved much, but her eyes fluttered open now and then, taking in her new surroundings. Jake lived on the outskirts of town in a modest house surrounded by sprawling farmland. It wasn't much, but it was quiet and safe, exactly what Daisy needed. As he carried her inside, her body still wrapped in the clinic's blankets, he promised himself that she'd never have to feel fear or abandonment again. He set up a cozy corner in the living room, complete with a soft bed and a space heater to keep her warm. Daisy sank into the bed with a low sigh, her body relaxing for the first time in what seemed like days. Jake sat beside her, his hand resting gently on her head. "You're home now," he murmured. "No more tracks, no more chains." Over the next few days, Daisy's strength began to return, albeit slowly. She started eating small portions of the special food Dr. Harris had given Jake, and her eyes began to brighten with life. Jake spent every spare moment with her, talking to her as though she could understand every word. "You remind me of my old dog, Max," he said one evening, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside her. "He was a mutt, but he had that same fire in his eyes. Tough as nails, just like you." Daisy tilted her head slightly at the sound of his voice, her ears perking up. It was a small gesture, but it made Jake smile. Each day brought tiny victories. Her first tentative steps around the living room, her wagging tail when Jake came back from work. Slowly but surely, the fragile bond between them began to grow. But as Daisy improved, questions about her past weighed heavily on Jake's mind. Who had tied her to the tracks? And why? The thought of someone being capable of such cruelty filled him with anger. He couldn't help but wonder if whoever had done it might come looking for her, though he quickly pushed the thought aside. She was safe now, and that was all that mattered. Jake's neighbors soon noticed the pit bull that followed him around the yard or sat by his side on the porch. Though Daisy's scars were still visible, her demeanor had softened. The initial wariness she'd shown around strangers began to fade as she adjusted to her new life. Still, not everyone welcomed her presence. "Be careful with that dog," warned Mr. Phillips, the elderly man who lived a few houses down. "Pit bulls can be dangerous, you know." Jake bristled at the comment but kept his voice steady. "Daisy's not dangerous. She's been through hell, but she's kind. You'd see that if you gave her a chance." Phillips muttered something under his breath but didn't press the issue. Jake knew that changing people's minds about pit bulls wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to show everyone the kind, resilient soul behind Daisy's scars. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a deep shade of orange, Jake sat on the porch with Daisy by his side. She rested her head on his knee, her eyes half closed in contentment. For the first time in weeks, Jake allowed himself to relax, the weight of the past few days lifting slightly. "You're stronger than I'll ever be," he said softly, scratching behind her ears. "Whatever happens next, we'll face it together. I promise." Daisy looked up at him, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding. It was as if she knew, deep down, that she had found her person, the one who would never leave her behind. The days turned into weeks, and Daisy's recovery was nothing short of remarkable. Her once frail body had begun to fill out, her coat now glistening in the sunlight as though her spirit was healing alongside her physical wounds. Jake marveled at her resilience. Every morning, Daisy would greet him with a wagging tail, her eyes full of gratitude. She no longer flinched at sudden noises, and her trust in Jake grew with each passing day. But the peace they had found was soon overshadowed by lingering questions about Daisy's past. Jake couldn't ignore the nagging thought of how she had ended up tied to the train tracks. The cruelty of it gnawed at him, and he knew he needed answers, not just for himself, but for Daisy. One crisp Saturday morning, Jake decided to retrace his steps. With Daisy sitting in the passenger seat of his truck, he drove back to the tracks where he had found her. The scene was eerily quiet, the rusted rails glinting under the autumn sun. Jake parked the truck and got out, his boots crunching against the gravel as he scanned the area. Daisy stayed close to his side, her nose twitching as she sniffed the air. Her demeanor was calm at first, but as they approached the spot where she had been tied, her body stiffened. A low whine escaped her throat, and she pressed herself against Jake's leg. "It's okay, girl," Jake murmured, crouching down to stroke her head. "You're safe now." Daisy's eyes darted around nervously, as if she expected danger to appear at any moment. Jake felt a surge of anger boil in his chest, not at her, but at whoever had done this to her. He studied the ground, noticing faint drag marks and a broken piece of nylon leash still tangled in the weeds. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure she wouldn't escape. Jake took photos of the scene with his phone, his mind racing with possibilities. Was it an act of malice? Or had Daisy simply been collateral damage in someone's twisted plan? The answers felt just out of reach, but Jake was determined to uncover the truth. He decided to visit the local animal shelter to see if anyone had reported a missing pit bull matching Daisy's description. The shelter was small but well maintained, its walls lined with photos of dogs waiting for forever homes. A young woman named Emily greeted him at the front desk, her smile warm and welcoming. "Hi there," she said, glancing down at Daisy. "She's gorgeous. Is she yours?" Jake hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, you could say that." I found her a few weeks ago, tied to the train tracks. His voice tightened as he spoke, the memory still raw. Emily's smile faded. Tied to the tracks? That's horrible. Do you think someone abandoned her on purpose? That's what I'm trying to figure out, Jake replied. I was hoping you might have records of her or maybe know someone who could help. Emily nodded and began typing into her computer. After a few moments, she shook her head. I don't see anything about a missing pit bull matching her description. But, she hesitated, glancing at Jake. We've had a few reports of dog-fighting rings in the area. It's possible she escaped from something like that. The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. He looked down at Daisy, who was now lying at his feet, her head resting on her paws. The thought of her being used for such a cruel purpose made his blood boil. Is there anything I can do? He asked, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. Emily leaned forward, her expression serious. If you're willing, you could report what you found to the local authorities. It might not lead anywhere, but it could help build a case if there's illegal activity going on. That evening, Jake sat on his porch with Daisy curled up beside him. The sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, but Jake's mind was elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about what Emily had said. The idea of Daisy being a victim of a dog-fighting ring was almost too much to bear. Whatever they put you through, it's over now, he said softly, running his hand along her back. I promise, no one's ever going to hurt you again. Daisy lifted her head and looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of trust and something deeper, resilience. It was as if she understood the promise he was making, and in that moment Jake felt more determined than ever to protect her. But the past had a way of creeping back in. The next morning, as Jake was cleaning up the yard, he noticed a black truck idling near the edge of his property. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see who was inside. Jake watched it closely, his unease growing with every passing second. After a moment, the truck sped off, leaving a trail of dust in its wake. Jake's gut told him it wasn't a coincidence. Someone had been watching. And whoever they were, they might not be done with Daisy. Jake couldn't shake the image of the black truck, the way it lingered near his property before speeding off. It was deliberate, calculated. He had learned to trust his instincts over the years, and they were screaming that this wasn't a coincidence. Someone had been watching, and they weren't there by accident. His thoughts immediately turned to Daisy. Was it possible that whoever had left her tied to the tracks had come back to finish what they started? That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jake sat on the porch with Daisy lying at his feet. The autumn air was crisp, carrying with it a stillness that felt heavier than usual. Daisy had grown more confident over the weeks, but tonight she seemed uneasy, her ears twitching at every faint sound. You feel it too, don't you, girl? Jake murmured, scratching behind her ears. She let out a soft whine, her gaze fixed on the tree line at the edge of the property. Jake followed her eyes but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered, prickling the back of his neck. The next morning, Jake decided it was time to take action. He drove into town and filed a report with the local authorities, detailing everything. Finding Daisy on the tracks, the broken leash, the black truck near his property. The officer taking a statement, a young man named Officer Reed, listened intently, jotting down notes as Jake spoke. Dog-fighting rings have been a growing issue around here, Reed said, his tone grim. It's possible Daisy was part of one, and whoever dumped her might be trying to cover their tracks. No pun intended. Jake clenched his fists at the thought. What can we do to stop them? Reed hesitated. Without concrete evidence, it's hard to build a case. But if you see that truck again or notice anything suspicious, call us immediately. We'll keep an eye on the area. It wasn't the answer Jake wanted, but it was a start. As he drove back home, his mind raced with possibilities. He couldn't just sit around waiting for something to happen. If Daisy was in danger, he needed to be ready. That evening, Jake began making preparations. He reinforced the locks on his doors and windows, installed motion-activated lights around the property, and even borrowed a trail camera from a friend to monitor the driveway. Daisy watched him curiously as he worked, her head tilting every time he hammered a nail or tested the lights. "This is for you, girl," Jake said, crouching down to rub her head. "No one's ever going to hurt you again. I promise." Daisy responded with a gentle lick to his hand, her eyes reflecting the trust she had come to place in him. It was a bond Jake hadn't expected, but cherished deeply. She had given him a purpose, and he wasn't about to let her down. 2 nights later, the black truck returned. Jake had been dozing off in the living room when the motion lights outside suddenly flared to life. Daisy, who had been curled up on her bed, shot up instantly, her ears perked and her body tense. Jake grabbed the trail camera monitor and saw the truck idling at the edge of the driveway. Its headlights were off, and the silhouette of a person was barely visible through the tinted windows. His heart pounded as he grabbed his phone and dialed the police. "This is Jake Henderson," he said, keeping his voice low. "That truck I told you about, it's back, right outside my property." "Stay inside and don't engage," Officer Reed instructed. "We're sending a unit your way." Jake hung up and set the phone down, his eyes never leaving the monitor. Daisy stood beside him, her body taut like a coiled spring. She let out a low growl, her gaze fixed on the screen. Jake placed a calming hand on her back. "Easy, girl. Help's on the way." The minutes stretched into what felt like hours as they waited. The truck didn't move, its presence like a dark shadow looming over the property. Then, just as the sound of approaching sirens broke the silence, the truck's engine roared to life. It sped off down the road, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. When the police arrived, they found tire marks on the driveway, but little else. Officer Reed examined the trail camera footage, his jaw tightening as he watched the black truck on the screen. "They're testing you," he said, "seeing how far they can push before you react. But they won't stop here. We'll need to stay vigilant." Jake nodded, his resolve hardening. "Whatever it takes, I'm not letting them near her." Reed clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You're doing the right thing. Daisy's lucky to have you." That night, as the house fell quiet again, Jake sat beside Daisy on the floor, his hand resting on her head. "They're not going to win," he said softly. "No matter what it takes, we'll get through this." Daisy leaned into him, her body relaxing for the first time in hours. Jake felt a surge of determination. The people who had hurt her might be out there, but he wasn't alone anymore. Together, he and Daisy were stronger than any shadow from the past. The morning after the truck's unsettling visit, Jake woke early, his mind already racing with plans. Daisy sat by his side as he sipped his coffee on the porch, her calm demeanor masking the tension they both felt. The trail camera footage replayed in his head. The truck's dark outline, the figure lurking inside, the way it had sped off as the police approached. It wasn't over, and Jake knew it. Determined to protect Daisy and uncover the truth, Jake reached out to Officer Reed. The young officer had been proactive since their first meeting, and together they devised a plan to set a trap for whoever was behind the truck. Reed assured Jake that increased patrols would cover the area, but Jake wasn't content to rely on the police alone. He wanted to be ready for anything. That evening, Jake reinforced his property once more. He installed additional cameras, set up alarms on the perimeter, and made sure every door and window was secure. Daisy followed him around the house, her quiet presence grounding him as he prepared for what felt like an inevitable confrontation. As night fell, the air grew colder, and an eerie stillness settled over the property. Jake sat in the living room with Daisy at his feet, his eyes glued to the trail camera monitor. The hours ticked by with no sign of the truck, but the tension in the room was palpable. Around midnight, Daisy's ears perked up, and a low growl rumbled in her throat. Jake froze, his gaze darting to the monitor. Sure enough, the black truck had returned. This time it pulled into the driveway, its headlights slicing through the darkness. Jake's heart raced as he grabbed his phone and dialed Officer Reed. "They're here," he whispered urgently. "The truck's in the driveway." "Stay inside," Reed replied. "We're on our way." Jake hung up and turned his attention back to the screen. The truck's engine idled, and the figure inside didn't move. Then, to Jake's horror, the driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face obscured by the shadows. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if testing the boundaries of Jake's property. Daisy stood beside Jake, her body tense and her growl growing louder. "Stay calm, girl," Jake murmured, placing a hand on her back. But inside, his own nerves were fraying. The man stopped near the edge of the porch, his gaze fixed on the house. "You've got something that doesn't belong to you," he called out, his voice low and menacing. "Hand her over, and we'll be on our way." Jake felt a surge of anger at the words. He stood, stepping into the glow of the porch light. "She's not yours," he said firmly, "and you're trespassing. Leave now, or the cops will deal with you." The man laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent a chill down Jake's spine. "You think the cops scare me? That dog's mine. She belongs to me." "No, she doesn't," Jake shot back, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "You lost that right the moment you left her to die." The man took a step forward, but the sound of approaching sirens stopped him in his tracks. He cursed under his breath and turned back toward the truck. "This isn't over," he growled, before climbing into the vehicle and speeding off into the night. The police arrived moments later, their flashing lights illuminating the driveway. Officer Reed jumped out of his car, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "What happened?" he asked, scanning the area. Jake recounted the encounter, his voice shaking slightly as he described the man's words. Reed's jaw tightened. "He's escalating. That means we're getting close. We'll find him, Jake." The officer's reassurance brought little comfort. The man's parting words echoed in Jake's mind. This isn't over. But as he looked down at Daisy, who had remained by his side through it all, his resolve hardened. No matter what it took, he would protect her. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. The police increased their patrols, and Jake worked tirelessly to gather more evidence. He reviewed the trail camera footage with Reed, identifying key details about the truck and the man's appearance. Slowly but surely, the pieces of the puzzle began to come together. Through Reed's investigation, they learned that the man was linked to a local dog fighting ring that had been operating under the radar for years. Daisy wasn't just a random victim. She was likely a former fighter who had been discarded when she was no longer useful. The realization filled Jake with rage, but also a deep sense of purpose. Daisy's survival wasn't just a stroke of luck. It was a chance to bring justice to others like her. One evening, as Jake sat on the porch with Daisy by his side, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink, he felt a rare sense of peace. The danger wasn't gone, but for the first time, he felt like they were making progress. Daisy had become more than just a dog to him. She was a symbol of resilience, a reminder that, even in the face of cruelty, there was hope. "You're stronger than anyone I know," Jake said softly, scratching behind her ears. Daisy looked up at him, her eyes filled with trust and gratitude. It was a look that reminded him why he was fighting so hard to protect her. The road ahead was uncertain, but Jake knew one thing for sure. He and Daisy would face it together. The quiet of the morning felt different, almost as if the air itself carried a sense of anticipation. Jake woke early, his usual routine interrupted by an unshakable sense that today would bring something decisive. Daisy was already awake, her eyes following his every move as he poured a cup of coffee and stepped onto the porch. Her tail wagged softly when he crouched down to scratch behind her ears. "You ready for whatever comes next, girl?" he asked. Daisy responded with a gentle lick to his hand, her presence as steadying as ever. The events of the past few weeks had left Jake with a mix of exhaustion and determination. The black truck, the threatening man, and the discovery of Daisy's ties to a dog-fighting ring had weighed heavily on him. but with Officer Reed's help, there had been progress. Evidence was piling up, and leads were pointing directly to the man who had confronted Jake that night. Later that morning, Officer Reed called with an update. "We've tracked down the owner of the truck," he said. "His name's Travis Cole. He's got a record, animal cruelty, illegal breeding, and suspected involvement in dogfighting. We've been building a case against him for years, but Daisy might be the key to finally bringing him down." Jake's grip on the phone tightened. "What do you need from me?" "We need to make this airtight," Reed explained. "If you're willing, we'll need your testimony and any additional footage you've got from those trail cameras. With enough evidence, we can get a warrant to search his property." Jake didn't hesitate. "Whatever it takes. Let's make sure this stops here." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Jake worked closely with Reed, providing every piece of information he had. Daisy became a central part of the case, her scars and injuries serving as undeniable proof of the horrors she had endured. Jake hated that her suffering had to be laid bare, but he knew it was necessary to bring justice, not just for her, but for every dog still trapped in that world. Finally, the warrant was secured. Reed and his team prepared for the raid, and Jake insisted on being nearby, even if he couldn't actively participate. "I owe it to her," he said firmly. Reed didn't argue. The raid took place at dawn, the police moving swiftly and decisively onto Travis Cole's property. Jake watched from a distance, his heart pounding as he saw officers escorting several dogs out of the makeshift kennels. Some were emaciated, their bodies riddled with scars, while others cowered in fear, their spirits broken by years of abuse. When Reed approached Jake afterward, his expression was one of cautious triumph. "We got him," he said, "and we've rescued over a dozen dogs. Most of them are in rough shape, but they're safe now." Jake felt a wave of relief, but his thoughts immediately turned to Daisy. He knelt beside her, running his hand along her back. "You did it, girl," he said softly. "Because of you, they're free." The weeks that followed brought a sense of closure Jake hadn't expected. Travis Cole was arrested and charged with multiple counts of animal cruelty, illegal fighting, and breeding. The rescued dogs were placed in shelters and foster homes, beginning their journeys toward recovery. Daisy became somewhat of a local hero, her story inspiring others to adopt and advocate for pit bulls. Jake was overwhelmed by the outpouring of support from his community. Neighbors who had once been wary of Daisy now stopped by to bring treats or ask about her progress. Even Mr. Phillips, the elderly neighbor who had warned Jake about pit bulls, came by one afternoon with a bag of biscuits. "She's a good dog," he admitted gruffly. "Guess I was wrong about her kind." Jake smiled, patting Daisy's head as she happily accepted the treat. "She's the best," he said simply. One evening, as the sun set over the farm, Jake sat on the porch with Daisy at his feet. The past few months had been a whirlwind of emotions, fear, anger, hope. But in that moment, everything felt right. Daisy had not only survived but thrived, and in doing so, she had given Jake a sense of purpose he hadn't known he was missing. "You've taught me more than I ever thought possible," he said, scratching behind her ears. "About strength, about trust, about how to fight for what matters." Daisy looked up at him, her eyes filled with the quiet understanding that only a dog could offer. Jake smiled, his heart full as he watched her settle back down, her body relaxed and at peace. The road that had brought them together had been anything but easy, but it had led them to something unshakable, a bond built on resilience, compassion, and an unbreakable promise to protect one another, and for Jake, that was more than enough. As the stars began to dot the night sky, Jake sat quietly on the porch, reflecting on how much life had changed since that fateful day on the tracks. Daisy lay curled up beside him, her steady breathing a reminder of everything they had endured together. She wasn't just a dog to him. She was family, a symbol of strength and redemption. Through their journey, Jake had come to understand the depth of resilience both in himself and in Daisy. Her ability to trust and love again, despite the horror she had faced, was a lesson in courage he would carry with him forever. As he looked down at her, a soft smile spread across his face. "We did it, girl," he whispered. "We beat the odds." Daisy lifted her head, her eyes meeting his with an expression that seemed to say she knew they had won together. If this story inspired you, remember, courage and compassion can overcome even the darkest challenges. Every dog deserves a second chance, just like Daisy. Subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who loves heartfelt stories. Let's spread messages of hope, kindness, and the incredible bond between humans and their furry friends.